According to an ancient Tibetan text, the most important moment of your entire life may last only a few seconds, and most people miss it without ever realizing it. Not because they're bad, not because they failed a test, but because they didn't recognize what was happening. That single moment, this text claims, can determine whether awareness dissolves into freedom or continues into another cycle of identity, memory, and struggle. And here's the unsettling part. This moment doesn't happen someday in the distant future. It happens the instant life ends. In a moment, I'll walk you through 3 stages this text describes: the moment awareness leaves the body, the visions that follow, and the force that pulls consciousness toward another life. But before any of that makes sense, there's something you need to understand. This text was never meant to be taken casually. For over 1,000 years, monks in the Himalayas studied death the way scientists study physics. Not as mystery, not as belief, but as a process. They believed that death wasn't an ending. It was a transition governed by awareness. And whether or not you take this literally, the psychological insight behind it is impossible to ignore. Because what this text describes doesn't begin at death. It begins now. Most people think fear appears when we're dying. But according to this teaching, fear appears because we never learned how to be still while living. We fill every moment with noise, distraction, identity. So when all of that falls away, the mind panics. This ancient guide exists for one reason only: to prevent disorientation when everything familiar disappears. It's known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And despite the name, it was never written for the dead. It was written for the living, the space between. At the center of this teaching is a word you've likely never heard before: bardo. It simply means between. Between one moment and the next. Between certainty and change. Between what you were and what you're becoming. In Tibetan philosophy, death is only one bardo. Falling asleep is another. Waking up is another. Major life changes, loss, transformation, reinvention are all bardos. Any moment where the old structure collapses and the new one hasn't formed yet. You've been in bardos your entire life. The difference is that in death, there's no body to stabilize the mind. Only awareness remains, and awareness becomes extremely sensitive. The 3 stages after death. This is where the roadmap begins. The Tibetan Book of the Dead describes 3 primary stages that unfold after death. Not symbolically, sequentially, each one is shaped by the same factor: recognition. Stage 1. The moment awareness leaves the body. According to the text, death is not darkness. It is clarity. The instant physical system shut down, awareness experiences a sudden expansion, often described as an overwhelming brightness or openness. Not a light you see with your eyes, but awareness without identity. No name, no history, no story, just presence. This is the most important moment of the entire process, because the text claims that if awareness recognizes this state, the cycle ends immediately. No further stages, no rebirth, freedom. But almost no one recognizes it. Why? Because recognition requires familiarity, and most people have never practiced being present without clinging to identity. So instead of resting, the mind reaches. And the moment it reaches, the clarity collapses. Why most people miss it? Think about how rarely we experience stillness without distraction. Silence makes people uncomfortable. Uncertainty triggers anxiety. Letting go feels like loss. Now imagine losing everything at once: your body, your sense of time, your identity. If awareness isn't trained to rest without grasping, it instinctively searches for something familiar. That search creates the next experience. This is not punishment. It's momentum. And this is where the second stage begins. Stage 2, the world of visions. As awareness withdraws from pure clarity, the mind begins to project. images, forms, presences. Some appear calm, radiant, and deeply peaceful. Others appear intense, overwhelming, even terrifying. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is very clear about one thing here. None of these are external beings. They are reflections. Every peaceful vision reflects the mind's highest potential, clarity, compassion, balance. Every frightening vision reflects unresolved fear, guilt, anger, or attachment. With no physical world to ground perception, the mind experiences itself directly. Emotion becomes environment. Thought becomes form. This stage feels more real than ordinary life. And once again, recognition is everything. If awareness understands these experiences are mind-created, they dissolve. If it reacts with fear or attachment, they intensify. A psychological mirror. This is where the text becomes less mystical and more precise. Modern psychology describes something similar when it talks about the unconscious. Unexamined fears don't disappear. They express themselves. The Tibetan Book of the Dead simply removes the filters. After death, nothing is hidden. Nothing is suppressed. The mind encounters itself fully. And this is why preparation matters. Because the same patterns that dominate your waking life dominate this stage as well. Stage 3. The pull toward another life. Eventually, the visions fade, and something subtler takes over. A pull, a sense of movement toward familiarity, images of places, faces, scenes charged with emotion. This is described as karma, not as punishment, but as alignment. Unresolved desire pulls awareness toward form. Attachment pulls it toward continuation. Stillness allows release. Rebirth, in this framework, is not a conscious choice. It's momentum, like gravity acting on the mind. Unless awareness is stable and clear, the pull becomes automatic, and a new life begins. Why this isn't about belief. You don't need to believe this literally for it to matter. The insight underneath is universal. Under pressure, the mind amplifies its habits. Fear amplifies fear. Clarity amplifies clarity. Death is simply the most extreme pressure imaginable. And according to this teaching, it reveals exactly how we've been living all along. The real purpose of the text. The Tibetan Book of the Dead is not obsessed with death. It's obsessed with awareness. Because awareness is portable. It doesn't depend on circumstances. And the only thing that crosses every threshold is the quality of attention you've trained. To understand why this ancient text places so much importance on preparation, we need to talk about something modern culture almost completely avoids: orientation. In most societies today, death happens quietly, privately, and clinically. Monitors beep, machines hum, voices lower, but there is very little guidance, not for the mind and not for awareness. In Tibetan tradition, this silence was considered dangerous, not because death itself is frightening, but because confusion is. Why guidance was essential. Traditionally, when someone was approaching death, they weren't left alone. A trained guide would sit beside them. Not to persuade, not to promise heaven, not to threaten punishment, but to remind, calmly, repeatedly, "You are about to experience clarity. Do not be afraid. What you see arises from your own mind. Remain aware." This wasn't prayer. It was orientation. Because according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, hearing continues even after the body shuts down. Awareness doesn't disappear when breath stops. It simply loses its anchor. And in that moment, a familiar voice can stabilize the mind, the same way a calm voice can ground someone in shock. Orientation versus interpretation. Here's a subtle but important distinction. The guide does not explain what death means. They describe what death does. There's no theology, no belief system being imposed, just a simple instruction. Recognize what is happening. This is why the text insists again and again that fear is the real danger, not death. Fear narrows awareness, and narrowed awareness mistakes projections for threats. Consciousness doesn't suddenly change. One of the most confronting ideas in the entire teaching is this: awareness does not suddenly become wise at death. It becomes intensified. Whatever habits dominated the mind in life, distraction, fear, avoidance, become amplified when the body drops away. That's why the Tibetan tradition placed so much emphasis on training awareness before death. Not through blind belief, but through familiarity, training while alive. The practices weren't mysterious. They were practical. Learning to sit with discomfort, learning to observe thoughts without reacting, learning to let sensations pass without clinging. Why? Because death is the ultimate letting go, and letting go is impossible if it was never practiced. The monks understood something modern psychology now confirms. You don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of your training. The role of impermanence. One of the most common daily practices in Tibetan Buddhism was reflecting on impermanence, not as pessimism, but as clarity. Every morning, practitioners reminded themselves, this body will fail, this moment will pass, this life is temporary, not to diminish life, but to sharpen attention. When you truly accept impermanence, trivial concerns lose their grip. You stop postponing presence. You stop assuming time is guaranteed, and paradoxically, life becomes richer. Why this was considered dangerous knowledge. This is where the text quietly undermines systems built on fear. If death is not judgment, if no external authority decides your fate, if awareness alone determines experience, then fear-based control collapses. People who don't fear death are difficult to manipulate. They don't cling desperately to approval. They don't obey blindly out of terror. They don't outsource responsibility for their inner state. This is why these teachings were traditionally reserved for advanced practitioners, not because they were secret, but because they were destabilizing, modern echoes of an ancient insight. Here's where things get interesting. Across cultures and belief systems, people who've had near-death experiences often report strikingly similar patterns. A sense of separation from the body, an overwhelming clarity or light, a review of their life, an emotional amplification. These accounts don't prove the Tibetan Book of the Dead is literally correct, but they do suggest something important. When the brain's usual filters drop, awareness behaves in patterned ways. Ancient meditators didn't have brain scans, but they were paying attention, very close attention. The life review isn't judgment. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this teaching is the idea of a life review. It's not a trial. There's no judge, no condemnation. Instead, awareness re-experiences the emotional impact of its actions. Not just what you did, but how it affected others. Pain caused is felt. Kindness given is felt. Not as punishment, but as understanding. And this understanding conditions the next stage. Momentum, not morality. According to the text, what happens next isn't about good or bad. It's about momentum. If awareness becomes overwhelmed by guilt, fear, or attachment, it destabilizes. If it remains open and accepting, it releases. Once again, awareness determines outcome. The same principle applies in life. Unexamined habits repeat themselves. Seen habits dissolve. Why rebirth is described as automatic. Rebirth, in this framework, is not a decision made by a conscious self choosing a new life. It's alignment. The mind moves where it resonates. Just like thoughts in life return again and again when they're fed. Unless awareness interrupts the pattern continues. Why this teaching still matters. You don't have to accept every detail of this teaching to see its value. The core insight is undeniable. Under pressure, the mind reveals its training. And death is the greatest pressure imaginable. So the question becomes unavoidable. How is your mind trained right now? Now we reach the part of this teaching that most people instinctively resist. Not because it's complicated, but because it removes excuses. If everything you've heard so far is even partially true, then death itself is not the real challenge. Unconscious living is. According to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the same forces that confuse awareness after death are already shaping human life right now. Fear, attachment, distraction, identification with thought. The after-death experience doesn't introduce anything new. It simply removes the buffers. The illusion isn't somewhere else. Most people imagine the bardo as a distant realm, something that only begins after life ends. But the deeper insight is far more unsettling. We are already practicing for it. Every time you react instead of observe. Every time fear makes a decision for you. Every time you chase comfort instead of clarity. That is the same mechanism described in the bardo. The mind creates a story, believes it, then lives inside it. In everyday life, the body distracts us from noticing. After death, there is nowhere to hide. Why most people remain unprepared. The Tibetan Book of the Dead never says people fail because they're immoral. It says they fail because they're unaware. They don't recognize clarity when it appears. They don't recognize fear as projection. They don't recognize attachment as momentum. And recognition doesn't appear automatically. It's trained. You cannot suddenly become conscious at death if awareness was avoided in life. That's why the teaching is direct, even uncomfortable. If awareness is scattered now, it will be scattered then. This isn't a warning. It's a description of continuity. Modern life makes awareness harder. Here's something ancient teachers couldn't have anticipated. Modern life systematically trains distraction, endless stimulation, constant comparison, identity reinforced through status, fear, and urgency. We rarely sit still, rarely observe thought without reacting, rarely question the narratives we live inside. And yet, we expect clarity at the most intense transition of all. It's like never learning to swim, then assuming calm when the current pulls you under. Fear-based beliefs collapse here. This teaching was controversial because it quietly dismantles fear-based control. If death is not judgment, if no external authority decides your fate, if awareness alone shapes experience, then fear loses its leverage. You can't threaten someone with punishment if punishment is a mental state. You can't promise salvation if salvation is clarity. Responsibility turns inward. And that is deeply unsettling to systems built on obedience. The final test is happening now. This is the most important insight in the entire tradition. The final test does not happen after death. It is happening in this moment. Every time you notice fear without obeying it, every time you let go instead of cling, every time you pause instead of react, you are practicing, not for death, for freedom. The Tibetan masters were not obsessed with dying. They were obsessed with waking up. The ultimate secret, stripped of mystery. Here it is, without symbolism or ceremony. Death does not give you anything new. It takes everything away. What remains is what you cultivated. Attention, clarity, presence, or confusion, fear, habit. There is no reward, no punishment, only continuity. Why this changes how you live. Once this is truly understood, life shifts. You stop postponing awareness. You stop assuming time is guaranteed. Petty conflicts lose their grip. Fear loosens. Presence deepens. You still care. You still love. You still protect life. But you no longer cling desperately. Loss becomes bearable. Change becomes workable. Uncertainty becomes livable. Because awareness does not depend on circumstances. Living with this knowledge. This teaching doesn't ask you to abandon your life. It asks you to inhabit it fully. To watch your mind instead of being ruled by it. To notice fear without letting it drive. To see identity as flexible, not fixed. To remember impermanence, not to diminish life, but to sharpen it. Every moment becomes training. The question that matters. At this point, the question is no longer, What happens after death? The real question is, how awake are you right now? Because whatever that answer is, that's what continues. A quiet invitation. Most people will hear this and move on. They'll scroll. They'll distract themselves. They'll forget. Not because this doesn't matter, but because awareness disrupts comfort. But if you're still listening, something already shifted. You didn't stay by accident. Final reflection. Imagine living as if clarity mattered more than comfort. Imagine meeting change without panic. Imagine facing the unknown without running. That is what this teaching points toward. Not death. Freedom. Soft forward loop, retention plus session time. In the next video, we'll explore why modern science keeps circling the same questions this ancient text addressed centuries ago, and what that means for how we understand consciousness today. Take a moment. Not to agree, not to believe, just to notice. Your breath, your attention, your presence. According to this ancient wisdom, that's where the entire journey begins. And it's also where it ends. If this video made you pause, if it challenged the way you see life, death, or your own awareness, then this channel is for you. We don't chase trends here. We explore ideas that change how you think and how you live. Subscribe, not for entertainment, but for clarity, depth, and understanding that stays with you long after the video ends.